Today, the Great Budget Bust Up. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, world's latest post covering finance and property news. It's Friday afternoon, and Tarric is back. What a perfect afternoon for a conversation about, well, economics, budgets, elections, all those wonderful things. Tarric, welcome back.
Thanks, mate. It's good to be back, and there's certainly a lot to talk about. And, well, where do you start?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that, remember, we are in an election cycle, so we are being spun left, right, and centre. And I think the problem we've got to try and do is separate the spin from the reality. And unfortunately, at the moment, I'm not sure that the mainstream is necessarily doing a very good job of tracking down one versus the other. So perhaps that's something we should focus on today. Let's get to the reality. Let's get at the data, and let's understand what's really going on.
Well, there's so much spin going on at the moment, especially with considering the fact that there is the how would you say it? You know, the undeclared election campaign. So we've effectively been stuck in a cycle now for quite some time, whereby we've effectively been stuck in the washing machine, I reckon, pretty much since shortly after Christmas, because there's just, you know, like the election's been coming and it's coming and it's coming, and you know, prior to the cyclone up in southern Queensland, it was April, and then now it's May, so it's going to be interesting in that regard.
Yeah, the spin cycle has been on for quite a long period of time, used quite a lot of water in the process. I'm not sure we've actually I'm not sure it's washed a lot of the dirt out, though, I have to tell you. I think that we've missed the cleansing part of the cycle, right? Because the BS is turned up to 11.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see exactly how it all ends up shaking out in the end, because there are these, you know, there is just how it all balances. Because I think part of the thing is that how you and I say things and how even the viewers may say things is quite different to, I think, how the voters see things. You know, like apparently the budget played pretty well with focus groups, and you know, personally, I thought it was really just a bit boring, to be honest with you. It was sort of just like, well, we already know, you know, for all of us that have been paying attention, we already know all of this. So yeah, it's an interesting one.
Well, I suppose that's the point, isn't it? That bearing in mind that we've got a greater proportion of younger voters this time than older voters for the first time ever. So that's an interesting demographic shift. Bearing in mind that the polls are showing there are a lot of voters who have not made up their mind yet. And in fact, the two major parties, from what I can see in the polls, are not doing very well. And so a lot of minor parties are bubbling around below the surface. The fact that we've still got considerable pressure on households from the finances. So, of course, they're being, quote, bribed or offered, whatever you want to look at it, you know, tax cuts either today or tomorrow, or maybe excise cuts today or tomorrow, you know. But the problem I've got is that there doesn't seem to be sufficient recognition of just how bad it is out there for a lot of ordinary people. And I don't know whether you saw the Morgan Cox incident on ABC Q&A a couple of weeks ago. Morgan was he's in the rental sector, and he basically stood up on Q&A and asked a question, a very straightforward question about the impossibility of being able to get a rental property, and linked it to the migration question. And I was extremely disappointed with the answers from the panel, because they really didn't take him that seriously, in my view. And, you know, there was some lip service. Yes, it's difficult, but they didn't really get into the detail of the issues. I interviewed him actually the other day. And what I thought was interesting was he was really the face of reality for a lot of people. You know, 1/3 of Australians in the rental sector, a lot of people really struggling. And I guess the question I've got is this election campaign really going to address some of the critical issues that really are there below the waterline, or are we going to do a little bit of fluffiness around the edge and a little bit of bribes here and there and hope that somehow magic is all going to stick?
No, it's not. I mean, at the end of the day, unless you're willing to address migration in a meaningful way with a genuine target linked in some way to the creation of new housing supply in net terms, you're basically going to be continuing to stare down the same problem that Australia has for quite some time now. So I think that we sort of face a problem where that neither side is willing to tackle the elephant in the room, that it's going to continue to persist. And I think that that's why, for a lot of people, I understand why they're frustrated. I understand why they want something different. And this is something that has been borne out in polls as well, that there are a lot of people who would potentially be willing to vote for the LNP. But unless Dutton goes to the right on those issues where they see it being important, and migration is one of those issues, the Liberals are just not going to pick up those votes, and they still may end up going to Labor. And I think it's just worth noting that that is something that's borne out in polling data. That's not just my opinion. That's something that Kos Samaras he made recently based on his polling data from Redbridge, showing that that is actually in fact the case. And I think that that's something that really just needs to be focused upon going forward. For, just the fact that people are begrudgingly making their preference vote known in a lot of cases. This isn't, so it's not going to be a resounding mandate regardless of who wins, I think.
Good point. And it's, I think, parallel to the UK election, because, of course, Labour got in here in the UK with a landslide, but on a very small share of the vote. Now, it's not compulsory to vote in the UK, and we don't have transferable votes. But what's interesting is that their overall mandate is well below half the population. So there are a lot of people saying, well, we didn't really vote for this guy, but he was actually a little bit less bad than the other guy. And so it was a vote against rather than a vote for, a vote of protest rather than the vote for policy. And I think that's probably what we're going to see in Australia too, because neither side really wants to tackle the critical issues. We've been touching on those for quite some time, whether it's housing or whether it's energy prices and costs, and a lot of other things too. Neither side really, to me, has a formula for anything different. And, is it going to be the same old, and therefore do you just vote against the other guy? And, it's interesting that mostly the people get 2 terms, but it could be that Albert gets only 1 term. So it could be interesting.
No, I think that's a really interesting point, because I've been looking back through all the various first-term governments in Australia, going all the way back to just prior to the Great Depression. And if Albo does lose, he will be the first-term government to exit without the Depression quite literally blowing up in his face. So I think that would be really quite a historic event. Although I will say things have tightened recently, and it's looking more and more like a very, very close run thing that could very much be decided at a seat by seat level, more so than perhaps than usual, because we're seeing such different levels of movements in terms of the polling for across different states. You're seeing the Liberals do very, very well with a bit of a strong swing there in Victoria at a federal level, but in other places, even say in Queensland, their first preference vote in polling in Queensland is actually down, not up, which I think is quite interesting.
Absolutely. Well, I think it will be fascinating to see how it all plays out. And I think it's worth underscoring that the undecided is still quite high. So there are a lot of people not sure what they're going to do. We've got a lot of new young voters voting for the first time as well, which is there too. Interestingly, some of the minor parties have said, well, we're not going to actually go into a minority coalition like the Greens, for example, said. So, I mean, it's all talk about fluidity. But I just want to come back to the budget because, of course, we had Chalmers standing up and saying, well, we've made the biggest improvement ever, And when you look at the numbers, you think, well, really? I suppose it depends on what you baseline the number from.
Lies, damn lies, and statistics, isn't it? It's just all a bit rubbery figures, and it's a bit. I think it's a bit disappointing to cut for that to come from Chalmers, because when he was the Shadow Treasurer, he was very much up on getting up into it with Josh Frydenberg on, okay, well, this is what you say, but what does it actually mean? What is the baseline? What is it in real terms? What is it in per capita terms? All these various different metrics that you and I and a lot of other people in the economics and financial Twitter community very much value. And now we're just like, oh, no, we're going to focus on the big mainline, headline figures. And that's, I think, something that's very disappointing about the economics debate in Australia more broadly sometimes. Just the fact that we focus on these figures, we say, "Oh, but we're doing so very well," and then you actually look into the real numbers, as you and I do on a regular basis, and you go, "But it's actually crap for like half the people in the country, and the other half of the people are doing, generally speaking, quite a lot better." And I think that is one of the big problems for both sides going to the polls, because both of them want to spin a relative position of Australian economic exceptionalism and Australian economic strength. Yet, that's not been the lived real life experience for a lot of people out there, and it's been quite a lot worse than that, unfortunately.
Yes, well, I've been tracking that, of course, with my financial analysis of the mortgage and financial stress and rental stress in particular. Rental stress, still 76% of households suffering cash flow pressures. And it always feels to me as though we've got the real world, where you and I can see a lot of these issues, and then you've got the political world, where somehow it's all nice and shiny and it's all sort of a bit, marbly, and everything's fine. And of course, for the politicians and the few percent, it's actually pretty cozy. So I suppose it depends on where you are. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at it from a statistical perspective, you actually have more people who are actually saying things aren't working for me than those saying things are working for me. So that's going to be quite interesting through the election. But I don't think necessarily that we're going to get a lot of breakthrough policies and significant changes in terms of direction. I found the gas reservation conversation from Dutton's reply quite interesting. I'm pretty sure that Albo will come up with some quasi alternative for the gas reservation system, because he can't afford to let that one get away. But even there, it feels to me as though it's sort of grudgingly talking about the issue, not because they really believe that this is a critical issue, but rather they think that because it could work from an election point of view.
I think that you're right. I think that there's a whole lot of politicking going on at the moment, whereby it's all just about optics. It's all just about getting those positive headlines and winning those votes. And I think it's really worth emphasizing that not that long ago, Dutton proposed a cut to net migration to 160,000 per year. And then he very, very quickly said, "Oh, no, we're not going to do that." And then it was, "Oh, we will tell you after the election our net migration target." And now we're not cutting net migration at all, but we're going to cut permanent migration, which, as you and the viewers likely know, that basically means we're not cutting migration really at all. We're just shifting it from one column into another. So I think that we're just stuck in this situation whereby we have these very, very serious structural issues in the economy, these very serious problems that are facing a lot of different households across the board, probably a lot more so than prior to the pandemic. But I don't see there being a plan of any real description to address those issues, to improve productivity, to improve per capita growth, to improve living standards, and all these other metrics that really, really matter in a meaningful way. It's almost a plan for managed decline, because there's just nothing there that's actually going to do what needs to be done. And I think that part of the problem is that we've got this issue whereby if you're going to propose something that's going to genuinely fix Australia, there's going to be some tough choices. There's going to be some challenging adjustments. It's not just we can flip a switch and then everything's going to go back to, focusing on businesses and productive enterprise and, sort of output growth at an individual level and all those things. It's just not going to happen. There's a great chart from Leith Van Onselen at Macro Business, and it shows what proportion of bank lending is flowing to businesses and what proportion has flowed to household mortgages. And it's just flipped. It used to be pretty much 2/3 businesses, 1/3 1/3 mortgages. Now it's pretty much 2/3 mortgages, 1/3 business. Now, if you want to change that and you want to reconcentrate Australia's economy on, entrepreneurs, small business, the productive economy, then you have to change that. But if you change that, it's going to kill the housing market. And there are a lot of people who wouldn't like that.
Well, it's an interesting observation, because I've what I've been talking about for some time. Of course, the RBA does have the power to actually influence the relative strength of lending to businesses versus households if they wanted to. They could do something about it rather than just pull the interest rate lever.
No, absolutely. I mean, they could sit down with the Council of Financial Regulators and, Treasury and the government could all just sit down and just be like, okay, we want to refocus bank lending on productive enterprise. What can we do to achieve that? And like you said, there's all manner of levers that can be pulled, at APRA, at the RBA, and to achieve that goal. But they don't want to achieve that goal because that would, threaten the two big words that matter the most to the RBA: financial stability.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, well, financial stability. And that's, of course, because the banks are over leveraged into property. They've overlent into property, which is why property prices are so high relative to incomes. And so anything that threatens that situation threatens, well, the financial system because of bad policy over 30 odd years. So, and did you see there was some interesting research? The fact that the RBA has been talking about productivity and productivity problems more than ever before in recent speeches and recent releases. So, they keep talking about it, but then they don't follow up with action.
No, but I think that's part of the problem. I think the thing is that the RBA just sort of sees themselves as this passive passenger to the actions of fiscal policymakers, and I understand that to a degree. But I think what the RBA need to be doing is not necessarily going off on their own and, sort of making unilateral decisions about the economy because, well, you don't really want unelected policymakers making those levels of decisions. But what I would like to see is them putting the heat back on the federal government for them to say, okay, if you're interested in productivity, here's this proposal. This will improve productivity. This will improve lending to businesses. This will, get capital directed in the direction that it needs to be. And then that drops the problem in the government's lap and just says, well, I dare you not to do anything.
Yeah.
And, it's ultimately up to the government, what path they choose to take, but it forces them to at least do something rather than the RBA just, collecting their $1 million or their $500,000 checks and then, oh no, it's broken. Oh well, golf
or job in the private sector. Never let it be said.
No, the old revolving door. Yes,
yeah. And it is worth just saying, I was absolutely blown away by the huge mention of productivity in the budget. I mean, there was just so many really powerful ideas about improving productivity through Chalmers' speech, wasn't there?
Yeah, because they really know how to. I mean, to be honest, it's kind of funny because you watch these speeches, right? And you listen to them talking about all of their goals and what they're going to do and blah blah blah. And in terms of like refocusing the economy on where there needs to be, there was a greater emphasis in Dutton's speech on the $50 million he's pledging to give to food banks. I mean, don't get me wrong, welcome help for those who need it.
No.
But if you're in a country where the focus is on giving, where the focus in like one of the biggest election speeches of the entire season is there is an emphasis on funding to food banks, you've got a big problem that needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
But here we are treating the symptoms instead of the cause.
Yeah, absolutely right. And for those who didn't understand it, my earlier comment was sarcasm. Okay, just so we're clear. We better go on to the slides because you've done some great work on them, and there's a lot to talk about there too. But I thought it was worth just having a little bit of a pre-slide conversation, just sort of catch up with what's going on. So let's move the slides, and there's a wonderful little chart here that the old cartoon really says it all, doesn't it?
It does at the moment, and obviously it all flips around backwards and forwards, but I just thought that was a nice one. And as always, the charts will be available at burnouteconomics.com, and if you were to subscribe in a free or paid capacity, that is always very much appreciated. So we'll get straight into it. Now, I posted this one on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, and it was, a lot of people were quite interested in it. And what it shows is data derived from the census that what proportion of homes are owned outright by different people, by different age demographics. And I think one of the things that it really illustrates is how many households in decades gone by, particularly in the 45 to 64 age bracket, owned their homes outright. Now, the 45 to 64 age bracket is generally the strongest earning age bracket. So you've got these people who are in a lot of cases potentially empty nesters or with older school age children, and in days gone by, they could have taken all that extra cash that would have been flowing into paying a mortgage and gone out and started a business, or bought, or spent more freely on a holiday, or stuff for their house, or spent money at a local business. And I think that just goes to show that in days gone by, people were generally more able to freely spend at various different points throughout their life than they are today. And that is detrimental not only to young people who are having to buy these houses for a whole lot more money, but it's detrimental to everyone who's just in the economy because there just isn't as much cash flowing into the productive economy than there was before, and it's instead just going to the bank and into the housing market.
There's two observations. The first is, of course, that people are entering the housing market a lot later, so typically 10 years later than previously. They're having to borrow a much larger sum relative to their income, which means that they can't pay down the mortgage as quickly. And so the typical mortgage duration is now increasing. And in fact, there are banks offering 30, 35, and even 40-year mortgages. And the third point is that because of the fact that you're having to pay a lot more, and therefore obviously more interest because the duration is longer, you hold the mortgage longer into older age. And so you're actually seeing more people going into retirement still with a mortgage around their neck and still not able to pay it off because the superannuation balances that they've got aren't sufficient to clear the mortgage. So we have got a hugely indebted population. And the other interesting observation is that if you were to do a little bit of analysis of this by income cohorts as well, what you would discover is that, of course, those with smaller incomes have an even smaller possibility of owning property outright. So, in fact, it's distorted not only by age cohort, but also by income cohorts too.
That's a really good point. And I think one of the things that's interesting about this chart as well is that in a lot of ways, the outright home ownership rate of people aged 55 to 64 is a look back in time. It's people who bought their first home, generally speaking, somewhere between 30 and 40 years ago. So these are people who bought their first home, who started building equity in their homes before housing prices became broadly unaffordable at a national level. So I think that's something that's just really worth emphasizing, that you've got these people getting to that point in their lives, into their golden years, into the point where they are where a sizable proportion are past their superannuation preservation ages, but they've still got this debt. And despite the fact that they were upgrading into their next homes and stuff like that, generally speaking, at 5, 10, 15 years ago or more. So that's a snapshot of how bad things were, of how bad housing affordability was then. What's it going to be like when you're talking about the current cohort of first home buyers, or even the cohort of first home buyers, say 5 years ago, when they get to that point, when they're older, when they've got these larger and larger mortgages to pay off that they've taken on later and later in life. I shudder to think, just how challenging it could get, because I think that's a major issue as well. Just like, okay, currently speaking, the boomers and stuff like that, the boomer age demographic is displacing those who came before them in that older age demographic. And it's true that in aggregate, that they are much, much wealthier, they have much, much higher incomes, and they are much, much wealthier. So they are then spending a lot more, and that is benefiting the economy. But my concern is that when the younger parts of Gen X, the older parts of Gen Y start feeding through into those older age demographics, that things could get a whole lot more challenging because they're just not going to have the same level of free cash flow to be spending on stuff that the boomers did at the same time. So I think that could be something that's really interesting. Although I will say one thing that could end up dramatically altering that is just how the wealth transfer flows through to younger demographics. Because obviously, boomers are not going to be, the elder boomers are not going to be on this earth forever. So, in 15 or 20 years' time, there's going to be a lot of these Gen Xers and older Gen Ys getting these inheritances. But the issue is they're generally going to flow from the wealthy to the wealthy. And while that's going to improve aggregate figures for those generations, to what degree it's going to improve at a granular level is another question.
Well, it continues this same concentration of assets. If you look at the bank of mum and dad, if you've got the fortunate position of having parents with significant equity in their property, they can hand some of that down. Or as the Productivity Commission report showed, the intergenerational wealth transfer is already actively underway for those who actually have intergenerational wealth available, but not everybody does. And so what you're doing is you're creating an ever greater bifurcation between these two cohorts as you go down the generation. The other interesting point, of course, is that you've got a rising proportion of people who are in the rental sector and will never own a property. And all the research shows that as you move into older age, those in the rental sector have huge financial pressures because they have to continue to pay rents into old age. And that is a very significant impost on the typical pension income that most of those people have. So we've got these massive distortions within the system, and it's all working against ordinary Australians, in my view.
No, absolutely. And I think part of the problem as well is that those who are getting into the market are increasingly getting into apartments. Now, as we've discussed before, when you say, for example, in New South Wales, 1 in 4 apartment complexes built in the last decade has a major defect. So it's Russian roulette with an even smaller gun than normal. And part of the problem with that is, like, I talk to people about their strata fees, and there are people out there, who are paying 6, 10, 12, 14 grand a year. And I'm not talking about places, with all these amenities and swimming pools and barbecues and rooftop gardens that demand that level of upkeep. I'm talking about just regular everyday apartments that have, maybe got a lift. And that's part of the issue as well, because if you've got a house, right, and it gets a bit run down, yeah, that sucks, but at the end of the day, you can afford to at least keep the lights on. But when you've got an apartment and it starts getting run down and you've got to fix it, you can't just let it go to rack and ruin. It needs to be done, and someone has to pay. So that's one of my concerns going forward, that you're seeing more and more Australians stuck in apartments, not by their own choice, who want to trade up to a house but can't. And if they're going to be reaching, the retirement and their golden years in apartments with these high strata fees that are consuming, sort of a third of a couple's age pension, we're gonna have some very, very serious problems. Although, to be completely honest with you, future Australia's got a lot of very, very serious problems, but we just sort of pretend that they aren't there and just, generally speaking, ignore them.
Well, it's beyond the 3-year election cycle, so, who cares? Sorry, me being cynical again. I will make one other really interesting and important point, and that is that I was talking to somebody the other day who's actually in a strata block, and roughly half of the apartments in the strata block are owned by property investors, and a considerable proportion of those are overseas. And the Strata Committee reported recently that they've been unable to contact those landlords, and so that those landlords are now not paying the strata fees. So effectively, the Strata Committee is having to up the fees for those who actually they can get hold of to help maintain the apartment that's there. So even if you are paying your strata fees, the chances are that your neighbour may not be, and that's going to get potentially worse, not better. And it's very hard for people who are overseas to be able to, be contacted and pay their dues. So that's something else to bear in mind when you think about the rich mix of people in an apartment complex.
No, absolutely. I mean, something that is increasing, that you're increasingly seeing. I mean, and I think the thing is that for a lot of people, the legal merry-go-round is something that's it's very challenging to. Anyone who's ever chased someone for money,
Mm.
knows how challenging it can be. It's fine for the council. The council can just turn around and go, haven't paid your rates. Cool. Well, we're just going to put a lien on your house, and if you don't pay, we're going to sell it, and you can deal with that. But when you're talking about strata, it's a completely different story, and you've just got to go through this process, and legal fees, as everyone knows, cost an absolute arm and a leg. So yeah, it's sort of a bit of a chicken and the egg situation, because until it gets to the point where someone owes an absolute shed load of money, going down the legal route may end up costing more money than what they owe. But once you get to the point where they owe so much money, it's so vital that you get the money off them that, at that point, it's sort of almost zero sum game levels of issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and unfortunately, the strata committees are not that well resourced and not well managed quite often. So effectively, the people who can pay have to pay more. So this is something which I keep talking to people about when they think about going into the apartment area. It isn't just the baseline cost today, but what it's going to be in 5 years, 10 years time, and how does that play out? So again, it shows you that the strategies of build high rise and build quick has a price ticket attached that a lot of people don't understand.
Yeah, yeah. There's I could tell some stories, but I'm gonna keep off the defamation path for today.
Very probably wise.
All right. Next slide. This is a good one from Antipodean Macro, showing the Internet Job Vacancy Index inverted against the unemployment rate. And I think that's a pretty solid relationship, all things considered. The labour market, something I recently covered at Burnout Economics in an article that was free for all subscribers. I'll get Martin to link it in the description below. And basically, the labour market in February slowed down fairly dramatically. There was there was over 50,000 jobs lost. Now, part of that could be seasonality, but it's not sample rotation for a change, which is interesting. And I do wonder to what degree we could see things potentially go south quite quickly. Now, this is all very much up in the air because we do not have a normal labour market, unfortunately. We have a labour market whereby the overwhelming majority of jobs are created in sectors paid for by the taxpayer. So there's these normal market signals of job ads and job openings in the private sector, in sort of in normal non-government linked private sector industries, just don't apply the way they normally have. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how quickly this turns south, because if we do genuinely see a tightening of the purse strings for the NDIS and for the various state governments, we could see things start to get challenging quite quickly. But as I say, it's all very much up in the air, and there's also a question of, if it does start going south, how many governments want to see that happen on their watch, and how many are just going to turn around and turn a blind eye and go, well, oh, whoops, NDIS growth wasn't 8% this year, it was 12. But hey, we're not having a recession, so that's great.
I must tell you a quick anecdote here. The Office of National Statistics in the UK, which is similar to the ABS, actually came out relatively recently and declared that their employment statistics aren't worth the paper they're written on. And they were basically arguing that, one, the survey processes post-COVID have actually not worked. Two, the seasonally adjusting processes they normally use aren't appropriate anymore because the markets aren't behaving the same way. And three, this issue of the government-supported jobs and how that plays into it was also, a factor too. So actually, they pretty much said, well, going to have to actually go back and revise some statistics. And for a few months, they really didn't publish decent numbers. So it's a fascinating observation when you think how much hangs on the unemployment data, and everybody sort of says, "Oh, well, look, it's terrible or it's great," and we've commented previously about how much these swings in the Australian numbers are there, and people can't quite really understand why they're going on. I'm of the view that they're so rubbery as to be really not that helpful in trying to understand what's really going on.
Well, that's part of the problem, isn't it? We've got a set of circumstances whereby the labor market could have turned. It could have turned hard, but we're not entirely certain that it has. And I think part of the problem as well is because you do have this concentration of jobs in those other sectors, in those generally government funded sectors, we're not going to know if the market turns anywhere near as quickly as we would under normal circumstances because like I've gone through all the various job opening data from the ABS and then I've charted that against actual employment growth in the 2 quarters afterwards to sort of get some sort of an idea of how well job ads actually translates into net employment growth and at what level job ads translate into net employment growth. The problem is that you look at the big three generally government funded sectors of public administration, healthcare and social assistance and education and training, and it completely blows the analysis completely to pieces. Because as far as the job ads are concerned, this many jobs shouldn't be getting created in terms of the ratio of job ads to job creation. It completely screws up the ratio and throws it out the window. So as long as you've got these jobs being created or that don't really sort of apply to the normal process of things and the normal indicators of things, then you've got a labor market that could turn very quickly without you knowing. And all of a sudden, you could have some very, very serious problems. And if migration stays as high as anywhere near as high as it is, things could get quite challenging quite quickly. Or the government could just keep spending heaps of money and just say, "Oh well, no recession. We'll just see how we go."
Oh, it's never been done like that, has it? Really?
Well, this is the last 15 years, like I mean, it's actually quite amazing when you look at the numbers. Just the fact that prior to 2008 the level of non-market jobs growth was roughly consistent with, wait for it, the proportion of jobs in the labor market that were non-market. But after all of a sudden it's okay, well now it's half. Now it's 50%. And then more recently it's like, oh, it's 75%. Oh, it's 85%. And then in some quarters it's just like, oh, it's basically all of them. So it's I can understand, if you're an economist, why this is such a difficult thing to predict because you've got the government pulling the levers, which is not necessarily going to act the same way as a small business owner or a CEO when they're deciding to hire people.
Yeah, and it's worth saying, isn't it? The Chalmers did have an attempt to try and redefine this problem in terms of market versus non-market. No, I mean, jobs that are actually directly paid for by the government versus those who are indirectly paid for by the government, like NDIS, which of course is still private firms, but actually private firms receiving public money. But that didn't really work. So we've still got this big problem in terms of the relative investment and support of all the jobs market directly or indirectly from the government. And that without it, we would have been in recession.
Definitely. And I think one of the really funny things is, do you know who did the best job torpedoing Chalmers's rhetoric on that? It wasn't Peter Dutton or the Liberal Party. It was Bill Shorten. Did you see his fight? Yeah. It was just I couldn't ask for more. It was perfect. The way he was just like, the NDIS is the unsung hero of the Australian labour market. It's saved, we now employ over 500,000 people, and I can just imagine Chalmers watching that interview going, "No."
Yes. Who, with friends like that, who needs enemies?
I do kind of wonder to what degree that was a bit of a, from Bill Shorten to elements of the Labor Party, considering that he did it just as he was going out the door.
Yes, one wonders.
Oh, here we go. Next one. Okay, this is a chart from Jared Minak, who I'm a big fan of. And what it shows is real capital stock per person versus GDP per hour worked, which is GDP per hour worked is basically just a proxy. Well, for some people, it basically is productivity. Now, real capital stock per person is a bit more complicated. And what it basically is how much is the total capital stock growing? And capital stock is everything from its roads, its railways, its airports, its it's business investment, it's housing. It's just basically everything that you can imagine that contributes to us all having productive working lives and just productive lives in general in a lot of ways. So basically, we're not growing capital stock at a rate consistent with our population. So basically, and this is something that Ross Gittins actually wrote a very good article on a couple of weeks ago. And so basically, because newly arrived migrants and also just people who already live here don't have the same level of resources that they should to maximize their productivity, to maximize their output as individuals, in economic terms, we're basically seeing productivity deteriorate. And until that balances out, we're basically going to see more of the same. And I think that this is probably, aside from the sort of obvious things like housing, I think this is probably the best argument against mass migration into Australia that there is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the fact is that we have got a huge problem. We know the GDP per capita number is, well, I did tick just slightly positive. Just
0.07%.
yeah, exactly.
0.07.
Yeah, eureka! The world has changed. But if you go back over the last, 7 or 8 periods, it's been negative, and this is the really weird conflict between, well, the top line GDP number, because we've got more people. Let's pump the population, and of course more activity, et cetera, et cetera. So we actually can avoid a recession at the GDP line, but per capita, no. And the point there is that with the investments falling away quite significantly, we are actually not catching up. So the infrastructure isn't catching up with the population growth. And that means it's taking longer to get about. It's taking longer to get a medical appointment. All of the sort of the fallouts from that at the moment are following through. None of that is helping productivity. And that's why I mentioned earlier on, the massive mention of productivity in the last budget. It was, well, somewhat absent.
I think that that's one thing that just I think astounds me, right? So productivity is crap. Productivity growth is just awful, right? I mean, and on some metrics it's going backwards. Yet Labor, in the budget is talking about wages growth of 3% or higher. Now, wages growth prior to the pandemic was in the low twos, and productivity was doing, as you can see on that, better at least than it's doing now. It was crap, don't get me wrong. Like productivity growth was awful, but it wasn't negative or flatlining. So one really wonders, where's this magical wages growth going to come from? I mean, like some of the Treasury forecasts were, for a couple of years from now, were for 3.75% wage growth. Now, unless you're going to have an inflationary episode, which they're not projecting in the budget, that's just not going to happen.
No, absolutely. And that's the point, really. The foundations are not there to be able to actually take the economy into a positive environment. And that's why I get so frustrated with all of the cross currents and all of the conversations from a political perspective. And they're not tackling these critical issues. The fact of the matter is, if the productivity continues to deteriorate or even stay negative, what it means is that we are actually, as a nation, becoming on an individual basis, poorer and poorer and poorer. And that, of course, explains some of the problems over the last decade plus. And by the way, of course, in real income terms, although income are growing a little bit more now, if you go back over the last decade, actually in real terms, most people are still worse off.
Yeah, easily, easily. I mean, well, if you get into the granularity of things, like generally speaking, people of 55 and over are doing better than the rest. But I mean, no one in this is doing well. No one at an aggregate level is doing well. There are some people who are they're doing immensely well, but you're talking about a small percentage of the population.
Yeah. I talk about the few percent doing really well, right? And those few percent have certain characteristics. They're often quite wealthy. They're quite well connected. They've got considerable offshore investments. All of those things are part of the story. Quite a few of them are politically aligned to the political parties that are actually in power at the moment. Funny that. But if you look broadly, then the greater proportion of the population, they're still actually in negative territory relative to a decade ago. And that's really the problem. And of course, younger people, as we keep saying, are actually bearing the greater burden of all of these stupid policies relative to the rest of the population.
Yeah, exactly. Because younger people don't at least. I mean, I think the thing is that if you at least have a house, you are technically the beneficiary of this. In reality, if you just have one, not really. But I just think it's funny just that young people just get tarred with this negative brush. Yet I think that they have taken the absolute crap sandwich that they've been handed very, very, very well.
Yep.
And I think that part of the problem is that the decline has been it's a bit like the boiling frog. Now I realize that the boiling frog is actually completely false in terms of its actual scientific basis, but in terms of just things deteriorating so slowly over time and then just getting bad over time, I think that if you magically talk to someone, let's say you talk to a boomer, right? From say, let's call it 1995, right? Now they've seen bouts of strong real wages growth in some in earlier parts of their life. Back in the 70s, they saw quarters with more real wages growth than people my age have literally seen in their entire working lives in a single quarter. Now that's actually a fact based on going back on real average earnings. Now, I think that when you look at that, if you were to say to them, "Hey, we're going to hand you an absolute crap sandwich of not only going nowhere for 20 years in real terms, but going backwards, and not going to be any worse, and people in your age demographic are not going to be any better off in 20 years than you are now," they'd have a political revolution on their hands. But because younger people have just been slowly handed crappier and crappier and crappier outcomes, it just sort of just goes by the wayside. And I think part of the problem is that you've got a sizable proportion of people who are just telling young people that everything's fine. Oh, it's just gotten more expensive, and you just got to work harder, you've just got to go further out, and all this other nonsense. And I mean, it's just like a young couple on a median household income can't afford literal regional centers, a sizable proportion of them anymore, even with the rate cut. And you're telling them to move out further. It's like, how much further do you want them to go? Do you want them to start building maybe some nice new housing? Views of Uluru, maybe. I mean that's about as far as you'd have to go.
Well, that's right. And of course, the other thing, if you move further out, then you've got more tolls to get about. So it's not just the cost of the property, which may be a little cheaper, but you've only got the costs of everything else. And one of the things I see in my surveys is that as people move out further, it's actually those other costs that bite. So they're actually net, not any further forward, which of course is why people say, well, you've got to build up in the CBD area. And then, of course, we have all those other issues. The other interesting observation here is that this whole story of younger people really thinking they've got a bit of the damp end of the stick is supported by the facts, because of course we've also got HECS debt, which is significant, whereas sometime previously that was less of an issue. You've also got the childcare costs as well, and this is another factor that people are still sort of, I think, wrestling with. So if you look at young households who need to have two working incomes to be able to get by, that means they have to spend more on things like childcare and other bits and pieces, as well as those high commitments they've already made. So they start not just at zero, but well under zero. Even without those wage increases, they got nowhere to go. But when you actually don't have wage increases that are actually above the real cost of living, then they continue to sink even further. And that's the dilemma that most people have in that sector at the moment.
And you know what? That leads us back to the chart on outright home ownership, right? Now, historically, like I talk to older people, people with grandchildren and stuff like that about what things were like, you know, 20, 30, 20, 20, 30, 35, 40 years ago. And they were part of those generations where, almost two-thirds of people in the 55 to 64 age bracket back then had paid off their homes.
Yeah.
And generally speaking, younger people were still able to buy in areas relatively close, if not in the same suburb as their parents were 20 years ago or 25 years ago. So you've got an issue now for young people whereby it used to be that you could drop the kids off with mum and dad for a day or two a week, and you could save the money on childcare. Or maybe you're in a situation where, because housing was cheaper, you only needed to work a couple of extra days a week until the kids went to school. So you don't have that village to help raise the children to anywhere near the degree that you used to when you could live around the corner from mum and dad. So I think that's another sort of, brick in the wall, so to speak, of just how things have changed, and not necessarily for the better.
Well, when you talk about bricks in the wall, the other brick in the wall, of course, is that the income proportion going on the mortgage or the rent has continued to rise, particularly for younger people. And a bit like the frog analogy, you get used to it. So it used to be that when you got to 25 or 30% of income, that was a problem. And of course, the old mortgage stress analysis was always based on 30% of income. Now we've got households with 40 or 50 or even 55 to 60% of their income going on housing. Now that has become almost a norm. And I was talking to somebody the other day in my one-to-one series who basically said, look, I've been struggling here, trying to work out whether in fact I can do this. I probably can, but if I do, I know I'm actually going to be sitting on the head of a pin for a very, very long time. It's going to be extremely uncomfortable. And yet if I don't do it, things could actually deteriorate and make it impossible. So you're almost at that impossible dilemma, whether you buy or whether you don't.
Yeah. Yeah, that pretty much sums it up, unfortunately. This is a good chart from the AFR that shows the projected growth rate of different elements of the federal budget from next financial year all the way out to 2035, 36. And, well, this is one of those that speaks for itself, I think.
Yeah, that one over there on the right-hand side, interest. That's the biggest expenditure category. Cough, cough.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? We're lucky that we have relatively low levels of debt compared to other nations. But my feeling is that governments, regardless of which government it ends up being, whether it's a Liberal government or a Labor government, are going to burn through that capacity in order to keep the plate spinning. Because, well, I just can't really see them doing any different, to be completely honest with you.
No, well, that's what governments do. Governments around the world are still borrowing more, and the overall debt burden is still rising. Of course, in the UK, we're at 100%. Japan's at 230% of GDP, right? And that's having a significant impact on what they're paying it. But it's just worth just reflecting that because of the decisions that have been taken, not just around COVID, but more generally, governments are actually more indebted, which essentially means they're having to pay more. And because of the changed risk environment, I'm thinking here of Germany and their announcement of significant investment in infrastructure and defense. Bond yields have risen in Germany quite considerably. That puts more pressure on the budget because they're going to have to be able to service that later. So it creates a problem not just now, but also into the future as well. And that's the other point I think it's worth just reflecting on, that these interest commitments are not sort of transitory. They become embedded. And in fact, there was nothing in the budget speech other than deficits year on year and year on year. And I know there's an argument of saying, well, some deficits probably are okay, and we don't have as much deficit in Australia as some other countries in GDP terms. But nevertheless, it's robbing the future.
I think the thing is that, in principle, there's nothing wrong with deficits. If you're taking out a huge, big load of government bonds, and you're doing that to invest in, productivity enhancing infrastructure, health infrastructure, roads, railways, ports, you name it,
Hmm.
then great, because you're putting your cash into something that will have a very strong positive economic multiplier that will end up creating more tax revenue, and you have a greater ability to then pay down that debt and grow your economy, which is fantastic. I mean, that probably describes, generally speaking, the approach of China through, say, most of the 90s and probably the early 2000s, before you got to the roads to nowhere, like, sort of approach. But the problem is that we've reached a point now where our infrastructure and everything is so expensive and everything costs so much that the chances of having that positive economic multiplier have reduced and reduced and just keep going lower and lower and lower. I mean, in some ways, it sort of reminds me of the sort of challenges of some of the latter half of the latter few centuries at times of the Western Roman Empire, where they got to the point where they couldn't afford to build the infrastructure anymore, and then it got to the point where they couldn't even afford to maintain the infrastructure anymore, and then it got to the point where not too long after that, everything fell to bits. So I do wonder to what degree that's a bit, sort of analogous of where we're potentially heading in the longer term.
Well, it does beg the question because the quality of infrastructure is a question. And, in the UK, we've got huge issues with potholes in roads and water infrastructure that's really old and needs replacing, but nobody's actually allowing it to be replaced and they can't afford it. As a result of that, we're throwing more sewage, untreated sewage into rivers and into the sea, which is reducing the quality of life and creating a whole lot of issues. It's like you can see how all these threads are unwinding. I'd also make the point that big investment on the AUKUS thing, or indeed big investments on nuclear power in 20 years' time, may in theory be useful, but in practical terms, it's taking a hell of a chunk out of the budget, which isn't big enough to be able to do the things we want to do. So this just shows you how critical the questions are in terms of where you spend the money and what you spend it on, which are political decisions and economic decisions, of course, with consequences. But at the moment, we seem to be so short term that we're not necessarily laying the foundations for a trajectory that will actually take the economy into a better future. That's a real problem.
I do wonder sometimes to what degree Australia is basically going down the same path as the UK, except the UK doesn't have Australia's enormous levels of mineral wealth, which has helped to sort of prop us up again and again and again when we've gotten into trouble.
Yeah.
So I just think sometimes, like, eventually China will go off the boil. India will not be in a position to, to match what China was. And what happens then? Now, like, it's okay for the moment, but even the thing for me is, even just a plateau at a relatively positive point is still going to present challenges, you're potentially not going to see those nice big windfalls anymore when everything goes to pot outside. So I just wonder, if we're on that same road as the UK, because you look at, say, for example, non-market job growth in the UK, and it's the highest in the Anglosphere, but we're catching up.
Hmm.
And if we keep going the rate we're going, it's not going to be long before especially if Rachel Reeves gets her public service cuts, it's not going to be long before we're the king of the mountain, and it's not a crown you really want to have.
No, it's interesting. Chris Richardson, of course, the budget commentator and economist, made the point that there was a period when Australia was extremely lucky, and thanks to the positive income flows from those resources and everything else, we actually muddled through remarkably well. But the question he asked and posed was, well, is that going to continue? Can we continue to be the lucky country when, in fact, the resources, boom is changing, the demand for example, coal is perhaps going away a little bit, and therefore, have we got a foundation for the future? And I think his conclusion was there are some big questions to be asked.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I'm not really sure that they're being asked, at least in a way that the politicians get forced to answer them, because I mean, one of the funny things for me is that as a journalist, I do talk to politicians, that media reps and stuff like that. But one of the funny things to me is that a lot of the time when I ask those big questions, those important questions that you and I talk about, that I talk to the viewers and the community about on Twitter and on other social media, they don't get answered.
Mm.
And I think that's a deeply concerning state of affairs because okay, they don't answer me. That's fine. I'm not someone who's got this this huge ego that they need to answer me and only me, and that's the issue. The issue is they're not answering them from anyone. So the question is, how do you have accountability on all these important issues, from a learned perspective? Say someone like Chris Richardson, who makes these points, and then someone like me asks the government about those points, and then those points get ignored. So, how can you have sophisticated accountability from a learned perspective and not just from, the 10-second soundbite on evening television? It doesn't exist. And I think that that's a part of the reason why we are where we are.
I agree. I think the critique that should be being played and the answers we should be getting aren't coming through. And by the way, I've had a number of conversations over the years with politicians, and there's a big gap between what they say to you in private and off the record with regard to a lot of these issues, particularly around housing, for example, than what they say publicly on the record, because a lot of them know that if they said what the truth was in reality, then this wouldn't be a vote winner. So we've got this sort of quasi world where they say one thing in the real land that they know, but actually when they're actually out on the stump and through the political campaign, well, they're saying something totally different, and that doesn't help. And by the way, I don't think that many of the commentators and a lot of the media necessarily push them hard enough on some of these critical issues when it comes to it. And I go back to that Morgan Cox example. That was a very straightforward and honest question from a punter who was actually up against it. And they really didn't want to give it the time of day.
No, and I think that that's just so just deeply disappointing in a democracy. It's not the way that politicians are servants of the people. And if the people have a problem, then you have to address it. And I think that's one of the really key things about, let's say, the migration debate, right? Albo said prior to the last election that he won't support a return to migration of 160,000. Now that was probably for the permanent intake, but still, it was very much a message of I'm not supporting a return to the status quo of pre-COVID. And then migration comes in at more than double the pre-COVID norms, and six times what it was prior to the big Australia era. So, but then you read this commentary from people, and they just go, "Oh, they're not," from people inside the political machine, and they go, "Well, they're not going to tell the truth about that." And it's like, well, if they're not going to tell the truth, they shouldn't be getting our votes. If they're deliberately going out there to mislead us and lie to us about something so incredibly vital, you know, how can we? And not only that, the problem as well with lies around things like immigration is how can we then prepare for the increase in the population if we don't know how big the increase in the population is going to be?
Sounds like planning. Well, planning requires forward thinking. Planning requires some certainty about what's actually going to really happen rather than, the spin. And it's like, oops, we seem to have a lot more people than we thought. Oh dear. Oh, well, it'll help the GDP and the tax take, so we don't worry too much.
I want them on the opposite side planning the next war. Let me put it that way, because we'll win it easily. Can we have that, please?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, this is a good one from the RBA, and it shows to what degree there are people flowing out of other industries and into healthcare and social assistance. And it's a fairly decent proportion. And I think the thing that's quite striking about this is like, okay, people would look at it and go, oh well, it's only 0.05% of the people in that particular industry. A month. A month. So yeah, that's a sizable proportion of people.
Yes, yes. And it's worth, I think, highlighting the fact that a few people threw this chart around and seem to miss that monthly little label. So that's a very important point.
Yeah, I just think it's funny, and I must admit, generally speaking, I don't really subscribe to the idea that we are seeing the public sector crowd out the private sector in a profound way to the point, that it's being deeply deleterious to the economy more broadly. But this does make a pretty good case that that is an issue to a fairly sizable degree. Now, I don't think it's a defining one to the point that say someone like Warren Hogan does. And
Mm.
I say that with a great deal of respect for the man. I get along very well with Warren and very much respect his opinions, and he may well be right. But I think that he is right, at least to the degree that it is a significant issue. And I do wonder to what degree it's going to be a potential issue going into the future, particularly if the growth in the NDIS gets maintained and we do see migration slow at least somewhat. Because at that point, if it wants to continue to grow its employment base, those people are going to have to come from somewhere, and that's not going to be from potentially from overseas.
Yeah, I would make the point that this crowding out thing is quite important to understand. And if you look at the infrastructure investment from the public sector, that's roads and rail and everything else, they are using the same resources as for the housing and construction sector. And a lot of people will tell you that it's actually more opportune for these construction firms to go into these government-backed projects because they get better margins and they have more certainty rather than in the housing and construction sector. So it's like, well, Albo wants what, the 1.2 million homes, but we don't have the capacity to build them. Part of the reason is we've got so many people building other things, which of course are government funded and government backed. So this is a good example where crowding out is definitely happening.
It's yeah. On that I agree. I mean, part of the problem with the construction sector is that there's the rise of the white collar construction worker. Now, to a degree, they're needed. You do need, people like project managers. You do need engineers, and you do need all these different things. But the problem is that the ratio between the hands-on trades who are actually doing the building and the back office trades has changed dramatically in the last 25 to 30 years. So you've got this much, much bigger bloated construction sector overall that's accomplishing a lot less in per worker terms, despite for all the various advances in technology that have occurred in the last 30 odd years. So it's something that really, really needs to be addressed. But then by the same token, if you were to magically address the efficiency of the construction sector, reduce the white collar workforce, congratulations, you've made 150, 175,000 people unemployed. Now what? So that I think is part of the problem that we face here in Australia. There's all these issues that can be solved, but if you solve them, there are some other there are other consequences, and those consequences are generally speaking, at least in the very short term, negative.
Absolutely. Well, there are consequences from decisions taken, or I would say decisions not taken.
Yeah, indeed, unfortunately. Now, this one I think should be almost this should be started with a qualifier. This population growth forecast, which is from the numbers in the federal budget, that this is based on the idea that the migration forecasts are correct. They won't be. So, and yet, even though this is based on that very low baseline, that's a lot of people regardless.
Yeah. And interestingly, note that Victoria has the prize for the biggest area of growth. which is fascinating. I wonder whether that's something to do with the fact that house prices in Victoria have tanked recently. So we've got to prop that market up.
Well, that it wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, I think the thing is that I imagine that the reason why that this is reflected this way is the fact that Victoria, generally speaking, does do better on house construction per capita than some of the other states. So, but still, I mean, anyone who goes out to some of these estates on the outskirts of Melbourne, you know, north, south, east, or west, well, southwest or southeast, obviously, because you've got that big thing called Port Phillip Bay there, right to the directly to the south. But if you go out to these estates on the outskirts of Melbourne and you see the lack of infrastructure, the lack of schools, the lack of roads, the fact that there's still people driving down the same bloody one lane road that was there when it was a farm 70 years ago, and it's now a suburb that houses 5, 10, 15,000 people. And it's lacking the buses, it's lacking the trains, it's lacking the hospitals, you name it. And then they want to jam more people into that. And it just doesn't make any sense to me. And well, it doesn't make any sense to anyone rational, I would assume. But I just think that just goes to show that it's not only the lives of existing Australians today that are being impacted by these crap choices from the federal government. If you're a migrant and you're coming here, particularly people from the Indian community, statistically speaking, because they are the most likely people to end up in these newer states, you know, I think it's about 32% of homes in some of these newer states are being purchased by Indians, more than any other individual ethnicity. You're handing migrants as well a crap sandwich that they're going to have to deal with for decades and decades to come. And, and not only that, but it doesn't stop these houses from being still just stupendously expensive either. I mean, the average new house these days costs $500,000. So you're getting this house, you're getting this land, you're paying through the nose for it. It's in there's a fairly sizable chance that it's not going to be terrifically well built. And then you get the crap that is the awful infrastructure that goes along with it too often at a time. And I mean, if I thought that it would make a difference, I'd say that we need a royal commission. But the thing with royal commissions in Australia is they find all this wrongdoing, and then they turn around and they go, and then they go through the cabinet, they go through the pantry, they get the wet lettuce leaf, they flail about with it for a little while, and then everything goes away.
Yeah. Well, I cue the supermarket inquiry, which came out with almost nothing at the end of the day, despite the fact that the truth is that we know that supermarkets are still exploiting people quite significantly. Look at their margins. And just on this migration question, I will just make one quick point because it's quite interesting. In my mortgage stress and rental stress analysis, if you look at the rental stress category, do you know the cohort that has the highest proportion of rental stress? It's actually those first generation migrants. So it's really interesting that a lot of those people who've come into the country and are in the rental sector are first generation migrants who are also finding that they've got an issue. So it's not true to say that all these migrants come in with massive amounts of cash and immediately go and buy property. Quite a few of them are renting, and a lot of those who are renting are finding it really tough to get by. So that's just worth just noting, sort of in terms of the cohort analysis.
One of the things that really annoys me about the migration debate is how, I mean, like obviously there is the side of things where the existing Australians who are already here get impacted. But then there's the people who, the people who advocate for high migration, who talk about the benefits of it and yada yada blah blah, right? But how often do you find these people talking about the very same data points that you're talking about? That the migrants who get here are, a lot of them are struggling. That they get here and they end up in these crappy situations. Living in some cases living in conditions that are suboptimal, shall we say, to put it in a polite way. And where are these people then? Where are these people advocating for, better conditions for migrants rather than just saying, oh, well, there's going to be like nine of them to a house anyway, so why does it matter? I mean, like the fact that, that there are some left-wing people saying that sort of stuff and then talking about, that we need that, repeating these business lobby, catchphrase bullshit, it just boggles the mind. But if it was the coalition doing it, oh my Lord, there would be hell to pay.
Very, very good point, Tarek. And, we've been chatting for quite some time. I don't know whether there's any other slides you want to
There's
home in on.
actually only one left.
Oh,
I've
brilliant.
actually prepared. Yes, I've actually prepared for the fact that we tend to be a little bit long-winded.
Oh, no, long-winded, thoughtful.
Yeah, extremely thoughtful and in depth. This is a chart of rolling annual real, so inflation adjusted resource exports per capita. And it just goes to show that the funny thing is if you look at the chart, right, and you look at around about sort of 2007-ish, just before the big spike before the mining boom, that is very nearly the peak in Australian living standards. Yet, you look at this huge surge that we've seen in resource exports, but are we benefiting from it? Not in terms of our living standards, we're not.
No, well, unfortunately, what we're finding, of course, is that a lot of the exports are actually, I think LNG for a great example, right? All of the value of that LNG is going offshore, and those big corporations overseas are getting the benefit from it. And we aren't taxing them properly, so we're not getting that coming back in by way of revenue back into Australia. And of course, the Australian story with the high gas prices equals high electricity prices means we're paying more for electricity than we should. We are not benefiting from the resources boom anything like what we did. And of course, the risk now with tariffs and other things is that the resource boom could well go off the boil as well. So even the big story might actually also be a problem as well. So this is why this election actually, I think, is such a critical point, because a lot of the issues that we've been touching on today are coming home to roost, like it or not. And it'll be really interesting to see whether, in fact, through this election campaign, any of those issues get aired properly, or whether actually they continue to sort of, sweep them under the table and say, everything's fine, folks. Australia's a great place to live. We've fixed all the problems and the next 3 years will be perfect.
Speaking of the tariff thing, have you heard about the one about the ship docking fees by any chance?
Yes.
Yeah. So just for the viewers, basically what the Trump administration is potentially proposing, this is a draft executive order. It hasn't been implemented yet, but it has been drafted. What Trump wants to do is if a ship docks at a US port, for each time it docks at a US port, if it's under a Chinese flag or the ship was made in China, there will be a docking fee of up to $1.5 million. Now, at first you listen to that and you go, well, all right, well, that's an American problem. But wait, there's more. In the draft executive order, it basically states that US allies will be compelled, and compelled quite strongly, to adopt the same policy if it's enacted by the US, and and you can bet we're on that list. Now, $1.5 million for a docking fee for a ship coming into, say, Sydney with a load of consumer goods is annoying. And yes, it's going to add a fair bit to the cost of shipping, but it's not backbreaking. It's basically would theoretically take the cost of shipping into Australia basically back to roughly where it was at the height of the pandemic. So yes, it would be inflationary. There is that. But on a shipload worth of billions of dollars worth of consumer goods, it's not that bad. But where it gets really interesting is when you're shipping out bulk commodities, things like grain, things like iron ore and coal, because the relative value of that iron ore and that coal is a whole lot lower than it would be for a shipload full of consumer goods. So that increases the price. So is Australia willing to turn around for all the thousands and thousands of loads of goods that it ships off to China every year to say, hey, President Xi, see that load of goods there? Yeah, that's going to cost you an extra 1.5 million US dollars. Why? Because Trump told us that we had to do that. And let me that could get real interesting because one or two things is going to happen. Either Australia says no, and then we deal with the consequences of that, or we say yes, and then we got to deal with the consequences of dealing with China on that. So either way, if that executive order ends up coming to pass, it's going to be fun.
One among many, Tarek, one among many. I think the fun has only just started. Of course, April the 2nd will be the next tariff round, although, is it negotiating? Is it real? We'll see. But, again, these consequences are actually flowing through into the political discussion and discourse locally to an extent. But again, I would highlight the fact that a lot of these very significant and important issues will be swept under the carpet through this election cycle. And we're going to be fed quite a lot of BS in the short term. And again, a lot of people will probably believe the spin. But as we said at the top of the show, there are some really important questions here about Australia's future, energy, housing, migration, productivity, all of those issues. So that should be the checklist. So when you actually think about, listening to the political debates, just see to what extent those main issues are actually being, properly discussed and properly, policy developed versus, we'll actually give you a bit of a bribe with regard to a tax cut, or what we'll do is we'll reduce excise duty on petrol for a year. That'll solve the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just emblematic of where we're at as for our political discourse. But it's just one of those things where it is what it is, and until someone comes out with a viable alternative to that major party duopoly, that's the way it's going to stay. Although, folks, if you want to send a message to the major parties and hit them where it hurts. Now, I'm not going to tell you how to vote, but if you want to send that message, every vote that they don't get, when you don't give your first preference vote to Labor or the Liberal Party, it costs them $3.39 in election funds. So if enough of you don't go out there and you put your local independent member number one, even if you want to put Labor or the Liberals number two, you can cost them money. And that sends a message in a language that they very much understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm of the view that, the use of your vote effectively at this election becomes really, really, really important. And just following the major two parties with a one or a two and one may not be the best way to actually send the message that we should be sending to those politicians who've been in power between them for a long, long time, and frankly have stuffed it up for many Australians. So it's worth thinking about as you listen to the election debate. I don't recommend any particular party or anything, but it is worth just remembering that your vote is powerful. So use it.
Yeah, 100%. Exactly. And I think it's worth, just once we find out exactly who the candidates are going to be, once everything is set in stone, it's definitely worth doing that homework, spending 10 or 15 minutes just going through, seeing what your various candidates stand for, in your local area or for your state or territory, for at a Senate level, and just spending that little bit of time to figure out who exactly is the best person to give your vote to, who is the best person that best represents your priorities and your values. And I think that's something that I think we can all do. I mean, I know that's something that's something that I'm going to do once all the candidates are set in stone.
Yeah, very good advice, Tarek. And, we have a vote. Make sure we use it and use it wisely, because it is the point in the cycle where we can actually make a difference to the future of Australia. And, there are some very big stakes on the table, and we need to make sure that we can, secure the future of Australia best possible. Tarek, thank you so much for your time. Thank you very much for the slides, as always, appreciated. And I look forward to doing it again with you when you can find time to do it, because I think these conversations, whilst they might be a little rambly, there are some really important nuggets in them. And we can't help ourselves. We can't help but touch the radioactive substance on the outside of the economy and say, "Oh, wow."
Yeah, indeed, mate. And I will just one little side note. Just a shout out to David Elliott, who I recently met out in the big wide world. Shout out to David and his partner, and they've both been watching for a very long time. And We very much appreciate your viewership, David, and to all of our viewers, we very much appreciate you watching and making it to this point in this somewhat rambly conversation.
Yes, and thank you indeed for all our followers, viewers, supporters. Please like and share this, and send Tarric lots of messages to get him to come on again soon. Tarric, have a great great weekend.
Thanks, Martin. We know how this ends now.
And enjoy the election cycle. I'm sure it'll be fun. See you later. Take care.
Slide it, mate.